The 5 stages of the apocalypse are like the 5 stages of grief. Grandpa's voice nearly made me jump. I'd been sat, facing the window of his room, staring out at the view. It had been a while since he'd last spoken. I had lost track of time. Now I turned to find him staring at me, watching me through milky blue eyes. "What did you say, Grandpa?" "The end of the world, son. It's close now." I looked at him and forced a smile. This was the most I'd heard him speak in ages. The poor guy has had dementia for the past year, barely remembers who I am anymore. Most of our visits consist of him sitting in silence while I waffle on about my friends and family. Share news with him he probably can't even understand. So despite the fact this sudden talk of the apocalypse was a little weird, I was keen to keep him talking. It's good to engage with them as much as possible. That's what Brian, one of the nurses who works here, always says. It keeps their minds active. "What do you mean by the end of the world, Grandpa?" I asked. "It looks okay to me." I gestured towards the window of his second-floor room, which offered a view of the garden outside the nursing home. It was early evening, and the freshly mown lawn was bathed in a soft golden light. The pond sparkled. Here and there, a few residents were out walking with family members in the grounds, making the most of visiting hours. I smiled at Grandpa, but he didn't smile back. "That's what I mean about the 5 stages, see?" He reached up and tapped his nose. "Denial's the first." I frowned at Grandpa. This was a new one for him. Sometimes he tells me old stories about his childhood, and during those he can occasionally appear quite lucid, but he normally loses his thread pretty quickly, abruptly shifts topic, repeats himself. It had been a while since I'd had something that felt like an actual back and forth conversation with him, even if it was one about the world ending. So I decided to humour him. "Okay, Grandpa," I said. "You got me there. How's the world meant to end then, anyway?" Grandpa shook his head at me. His milky eyes flicked around the room, as if to make sure we were alone. When he next spoke, he lowered his voice to a whisper. "They get in through your head, see?" he said. "They've been looking for a way in for years and years." "Who's been looking for a way in?" "You wouldn't know them. They're not interested in your lot." Grandpa raised a trembling hand from the armrest. He extended one gnarled finger and pointed at his chest. "It's the old ones they like. People with tired minds, whose defenses are weak. Like me." Okay, I'll admit it. By this point, I was a little creeped out. It wasn't just what Grandpa was saying, although it was weird enough. It was the way he was saying it too. There was an intensity in his eyes, an awareness that I hadn't seen in him for a long time. But any uneasiness I did feel, I pushed to one side. The important thing was that Grandpa was talking. He was animated. That was the bit to focus on. "Okay, Grandpa," I said. "So we've had denial. What are the next stages?" "Anger and bargaining." He lifted his hand again and once more extended his finger to point, this time towards the window. "If you look out there, you'll see it. Things are moving quickly now." Even though I knew that what Grandpa was saying was nonsense, I found myself turning to the window anyway. Looking down on the garden below us, it was an instinctive thing, I guess. When someone points at something, you look. The garden had cleared a little since I last looked out. I could only see 2 people at the moment, edging across the lawn. One was Brian, the nurse who works here, with his bright blue uniform and bulging frame. He's sort of hard to miss. Brian was accompanying an elderly woman for an evening stroll. It looked to me like Mrs. Lancham from the room down the hall. She's more with it than most, and often raises a hand to me in greeting when I walk past her in the corridor. She has a curly grey perm and slightly horsey teeth. A sweet old lady. As I watched, Brian and Mrs. Lancham drew level with the oval-shaped pond in the middle of the lawn. They stopped, turned their backs to the window, so they were facing it. The pond is one of the nursing home's better features. I've stopped to look at it a few times myself. It's full of colourful fish, drifting hornwort and water lilies. A real feast for the eyes. The residents all love it. Mrs. Lancham stared at it for the better part of a minute, her left hand clutching Brian by his chubby right bicep. Then she turned to say something to him. I couldn't hear what she was saying, of course. There was the window between us, and I was way too far away. But I saw her lips move. I saw the yellow-white flash of her teeth. Brian apparently hadn't heard her either. He stooped down so his head was closer to hers, so his ear was roughly level with her mouth. And that was when it happened. That was when I finally realized I was caught in the middle of something I didn't understand. Something I still don't understand. In the hours since it took place, I haven't been able to get the image out of my head. Brian leaned closer to Mrs. Lancham, waiting for her to speak, waiting for her to repeat herself. But for several seconds, she did nothing, just stood there staring at the side of his face. Then, just as he was turning his head to see if she was okay, she lunged forward and bit his neck. From my vantage point on the second floor, I saw everything. One moment, Mrs. Lancham was as still as a statue. The next, she was latched to the side of Brian like a tick on a dog, her horsey teeth cutting into the fat flesh below his ear. Brian screamed. Even though I was behind the window, I heard him. He yelped like a dying animal. Mrs. Lancham reached her bony arms around his body, fastening herself to him with a speed I wouldn't have thought possible. As he thrashed his body to try and free himself, I saw her feet leave the ground. But she held on. Even when Brian stumbled backwards and toppled to the ground, she held on. By this point, blood was spilling from his neck in red torrents. It ran from the place where Mrs. Lancham had fixed her teeth onto him, staining the collar of his blue uniform black. Brian was screaming for help now, his voice high-pitched and terrified, begging for her to let go of him. When she didn't, he started beating at her head and back with both hands. But it was no good. Nothing seemed to work. Mrs. Lancham remained firmly attached to his body, her mouth locked in place. After a while, Brian's struggles grew weaker, and then they stopped altogether. Finally, one of his fat arms flopped backwards and landed in the pool with a faint splash. It lay there like a dead fish. At this point, I became aware of a sound behind me. Low laughter. I'd been staring at the scene in the garden in a state of shock, but the noise snapped me back into action. I turned to find Grandpa staring at me from his chair, chuckling beneath his breath. "The thing people don't realize about the apocalypse," he said, "is it doesn't happen with a big bang. No floods or thunder. It just creeps in, bit by bit." I ignored him and started across the room, heading for the door. My plan was to run out into the corridor and start yelling for help, find a nurse and get them to call an ambulance. But as I reached the door and went to grab the handle, I paused. I could hear noises in the building, sounds drifting down the halls. Bad sounds. They were muffled through the wood, but all the same, I was pretty sure I could hear a woman screaming on the floor below. One of several voices crying out for help, crying out in pain. I leaned my head forwards, pressing my ear tight to the wood. Bang! I flinched. Somewhere in the corridor outside the room, a door had crashed open. I heard a man's voice, raised in alarm. "Mr. Lovell, I need you to return to your room right away. Please, we're asking all residents to..." The man's voice abruptly cut off with a yell. I heard crashes outside in the corridor, followed by a dull thud. The yelling started up again and continued for several seconds before tapering off to a whimper. I held my ear against the wood, frozen. Eventually, the whimpering stopped too. It was replaced by a soft sucking noise that made me feel ill. I stepped away from the door. It didn't have a lock, so I picked up a wooden chair from the table in the corner, wedged that beneath the handle instead. Then I ran back to the window and closed the curtains. After that was done, I sat back in the chair I'd been in earlier, stared into space. I don't think the fear of what was happening around me had fully kicked in then. Mainly, I just felt numb, in shock. I clasped my hands in my lap, twisting them together. "You're in it now, son." My grandpa's voice. I looked up and saw him watching me. His eyes were fixed on my face. "In what?" I asked after a moment. "The 4th stage," he said. "It won't be much longer now." All that happened about 3 hours ago. I'm still sat in the same chair, still trapped in my grandpa's room. A couple of times I've gone over to the door to listen, but I've never gone further. I can still hear things outside, see? Muffled cries for help, screaming, the occasional sound of feet in the corridor, shuffling slowly up and down, as if the owners are looking for something. I've peeked out the window a couple of times too, only a couple. The first time there wasn't much to see. Just Brian's body lying next to the pond, his arms still trailing in the water. No sign of Mrs. Lancham. She was there the second time I peeked out though. That was about an hour ago. I heard a faint noise coming from the garden, so I peered through a crack in the curtain to see what it was. It was a mistake. I wish I hadn't looked. What I saw down by the pond filled me with a sick terror that stayed with me ever since. It's left me with an image I don't think I'll ever be able to forget. The noise outside was coming from Brian's body. I knew that as soon as I peeked through the curtains, even though I could hardly see Brian. He was blocked by 5 or 6 elderly residents, including Mrs. Lancham, who were gathered all around him. Some of them were hunched over, while others were on their knees. They were eating him. Their heads shuddered back and forth as they took bites out of his fat, meaty flesh. Brian's uniform was a blood rag. What little was left of it had been stained black. His arms and legs shook as the patients he'd once cared for gathered around to gnaw on him. They were like birds tearing apart roadkill. And as I stared down at the scene, my mind numb with horror, Mrs. Lancham suddenly glanced up. I don't know if she'd seen the curtains twitch, or if she was simply catching a breath between mouthfuls. I guess it doesn't matter. What matters is that she saw me. I know she saw me. I backed away from the window as quickly as I could. but I wasn't quick enough. Before I stepped back from the glass, her eyes found mine. So, now I'm sitting here in the darkness. I turned the main light in the room off after what I saw happening to Brian. Just kept the lamp on. It's starting to get dark out, and I don't want to draw any more attention to myself than I have to. I don't know what to do. I can hear noises down in the garden and in the corridor outside the room. I can't think straight. Whenever I shut my eyes to try and focus, all I can see is the same image of Mrs. Lansham. Mrs. Lansham staring up at me, her mouth caked in blood, and a strip of skin dangling from her horsey teeth. Her eyes boring into mine, watching me the way a cat watches a baby bird in its nest. And that isn't the worst thing either. The worst thing is Grandpa. He was quiet for a long time after everything started to happen. So quiet, I almost forgot about him. Whenever I've glanced in his direction over the past couple of hours, his eyes have been closed. But they're not anymore. Oh no. Now Grandpa's eyes are open again. Open and staring. Watching me. Following me around the room wherever I go. About half an hour ago, Grandpa started to dribble. The saliva bubbled from the corners of his mouth and made a glistening wet patch on his skin. 10 minutes ago, he started muttering under his breath. I couldn't hear him at first and didn't want to get any closer to try and catch what he was saying. But he got louder. He got louder, and now he's repeating the same words again and again. Repeating them while he watches me. Only 5 words, but they're enough to make my entire body feel cold. The final stage is acceptance. The final stage is acceptance. The final stage is acceptance. Don't polit it, my mother said. Let it come out on its own. The tooth fairy will give you $1 for it. When I'd first noticed the tooth, wedged between the other small, pearly ones on the lower right of my mouth, it had filled me with a joy that I've never experienced the same as an adult. The occasion was special to me, as it had been my first loose tooth. Back in those days, my mother's word had been law to me. I had to wait. My little body ached with anticipation of waiting. Eventually, I couldn't resist the temptation of pulling any more. I gnawed on the hardest foods I could find. Taffy, apples, carrot chips, nuts, and the like. My fingers had tugged on it until I had lost sensation in them. I lost track of the countless times where I probed it with my tongue, desperate for it to finally be out so I could get a visit from the tooth fairy. But no matter what I seemed to do, the tooth refused to leave my mouth. It seemed that the harder I tried to remove it, the deeper it dug itself into my gums. My 7th birthday came and passed that summer, and it had been a good one. My parents had treated me to go go-karting at the local amusement park with cake and ice cream afterwards. The fun that I had overshadowed my anxiety about my loose tooth. It was already dark when our car had pulled into our driveway. I had stirred from the sleep I'd fallen into on the ride home and somehow managed to groggily drag myself out of the car and into the house and slumped down onto my own bed without a single hesitation. I don't know how late it was when the jangling woke me. There was a distinctly metal click to it, like the friction of a dozen small objects, all rubbing together in a cluster. It reminded me of the sound of my father's front pockets, always stuffed with spare change. I sat up in bed, half buried in my Thundercats bedsheets as my bleary eyes adjusted to the darkness of my room. My heart clenched in my chest as a familiar childhood fear took over. The familiarity of the room, which I had taken for granted in the daylight, was now lost to darkness, and in my young mind, anything could be lurking out there. I was grateful for the light that peeked into my room from my half-open bedroom door. Something shuffled on the landing outside my bedroom door. Squinting closer, I could see the outline of a tall, shadowy figure moving about. I blinked. "Mom? Dad?" The figure stopped, inching its head towards the direction of my voice. A chill coursed down my spine, and I didn't even know why. The footsteps trod closer, almost inaudible, towards the direction of my room, stopping just a few inches before my bedroom door. Then the door creaked open. I sagged in relief at seeing the dark, humanoid outline frame against the open light pouring into my room. It was tall enough for me to think that it was just one of my parents, and my chest sagged in relief. I expected some hushed words of comfort and to be tucked into my bed. Any sense of relief died the moment that figure stepped closer, and I saw it more clearly. The billowing outline, which I assumed were pajamas, were trailing weather-beaten red robes. A hood poured over its bowed head as it hobbled along my bedroom floor, its sleeves bearing its hands. It seemed to glide on its feet rather than walk, with a kind of fluidity that I'd only seen in professional ice skaters. Even at that age, I had the sense to know it wasn't natural. I couldn't see its feet under its tented clothes, but I was sure that they hadn't touched the floor once. It paused by the foot of my bed and just stood there, like a wind-up figure that had lost its momentum. Suddenly, it lifted its head towards me. It had no eyes, no nose either, or any normal facial features that I had come to recognize. It was as if someone had sculpted a human face from raw meat, the glistening bloody folds of its skin sagging over its bones, as if it was rotting alive, looking ready to fall off in meaty chunks. The only recognizable part of its face was its gaping mouth, filled with rows of mismatched teeth, some white, others yellow, of varying shapes and sizes. Its breath was sticky and laboured, as if it was drowning in its own lungs. A stale smell of mothballs and morphine filled the air. It grinned down at me, a thin trail of saliva slithering down its chin. Before I could scream, it was already on me. It materialized from across the room, pinning me to the bed with a large, fleshy hand pressed to my mouth. I knew that there was no resisting it. It was at least twice the size of me, with its forearm being almost as long as my torso. The sharp crack of bone rang out as it jerked its neck upwards, jaws unhinging so wide that I was sure its skull would rip apart from the sheer force. Frothy saliva flecked onto my skin as it let out a soft, choking sound. In the waning moonlight that peered through my curtains, I saw it didn't have rows of teeth. It had layers, dozens of misshapen teeth that ringed the side of its mouth to the pale upper palate, stretching down into its gullet. More than I could count at that age. It reminded me of a lamprey, the kind I'd seen in a half-remembered National Geographic documentary when I'd been flicking through the channels one day. My eyes widened with mute horror, glistening with tears. Every cell in my body screamed out for my parents to save me from this thing, but even if I could manage to move the massive hand from my mouth, my voice was lodged in my throat. It descended on my squirming form, engulfing my head inside the fleshy cavern of its mouth and muffling my cries for help. My fists battered helplessly against the spongy sides of its skull, but it didn't flinch. Vomit burned at the back of my throat at its rancid cabbage breath that blew into my face. Something long and dark coiled out of the pulsating depths of its throat like a black mamba, a forked tip flicking up before my helpless eyes. Just as I realized that the object was its tongue, it plunged into my own mouth. The ringed muscles of my esophagus tightened as the mass pushed deeper into my throat, squeezing the air out of me. The underside was covered in what felt like fleshy suckers that stuck to the side of my mouth as it slithered about. My head throbbed from the lack of oxygen, feeling ready to explode into fragments. After what felt like an eternity of it examining my mouth, it came across my loose baby tooth. It gave it a few experimental jabs, as fascinated by its slackness as I had been. The tip retracted from my throat, coiling around the area. Pain rocketed through my body as I felt the hooked edge of its fat, wriggling tongue hook to the underside of the tooth, deep into the gum, pulling upwards. I knew what it was trying to do, and my efforts to fight it off became frantic as claustrophobia weighed down on me, struggling against the inhuman body to no avail. The wet walls tightened around my skull. I was sure that it was about to swallow me whole. A wet pop resounded like a gunshot through my brain as I found myself falling backwards onto my bed, freed from the humid heat. Bloody drool mixed with acrid vomit was sprayed onto my pillow. I clutched the aching side of my jaw as blood seeped from the corner of my mouth, ribcage expanding with involuntary gasps and retching. It stood over me, balancing my bloody tooth on the sharp tip of its black, serpentine tongue, almost looking down at it with non-existent eyes. It slurped it back into the confines of its mouth, chewing down with a watery crunch of splintering enamel. When it opened its mouth again, I saw that the incisor on the upper left of its mouth had a new neighbor. A small white tooth stifled between it and a large cavity-pocketed molar. My tooth. Its mouth contorted into a sickening smile, its hand moving to rummage around inside the folds of its robes, looking for something. Reaching around, it tucked something under my pillow before pursing a bony finger to its skinless grin. Its fingernail cracked and blackened. I passed out with that horrible face still looming over me, burned forever into my mind. When I had failed to show up for breakfast the next morning, my mother instantly knew something was wrong. She had come up to my room to find me half slumped out of bed on the floorboards in a pool of my own half-dried blood. After rushing me to the hospital and getting my wounds tended to, they concluded that I must have hit my mouth on the side of my dresser while getting up in the middle of the night and passed out from the pain. From the concerned smiles on their faces, I knew that they hadn't seen it. I was all too content to let them believe that. I didn't have the words yet to describe what had happened that night. It took several days after the incident before I had the courage to look under my pillow to see what the creature had left for me. I flinched as my fingers curled around the edges of something solid and smooth, and I forced myself to pull it out. I had stared down at it, my mouth dry, the side profile of Susan B. Anthony showing up from a worn silver dollar, with 1979 emblazoned along the bottom. Though they searched every inch of my room, my parents never found my tooth. They never found any of the other baby teeth I lost in the years to come. I buried them all in the backyard, afraid that it would return. No money in the world was worth having to go through it again. When my very last baby tooth fell out, I wept. Even growing up didn't grant me an escape from it. Every time I closed my eyes, there would always be a brief flash of its face. Visits to the dentists became a regular source of dread. Whenever I was reclined backwards in the leather chair with a masked face positioned over me with a spinning drill, I got heart palpitations. When I was younger, I broke down completely. After all I'd went through, I thought that I would never see it again. I was wrong. When my 6-year-old daughter, Mia, proudly poked at the loose tooth at the bottom front row of her teeth, I had smiled along with my wife, even as my heart had plunged into the pits of my stomach. That lifelong dread resurfaced in the back of my mind, reshaping itself into a question. Would it come for her? I'd wanted to believe that it was all a figment of my concussed imagination. It didn't stop me from installing motion sensor lights in our backyard. I told my wife it was for protection. I knew better. It was after I'd put Mia to bed, her rotating fairy lamp casting dancing shadows across her pastel pink walls. I had headed downstairs to fix myself a cup of tea before I settled in beside my already sleeping wife. As I was tapping my spoon against the edge of the cup, the light blinked on behind me, notifying of motion detected in the backyard. I froze over the steaming beige pool, fingers clenching around the handle until my knuckles turned white. Probably just a raccoon, I told myself. I made myself check, forcing my stiffened leg muscles to walk to the direction of the glass patio doors, where I'd hoped the concealed view would ease my fears. I found myself facing my own pale reflection in the glass against the outside darkness. I'd been just about to return to bed when the lights flicked on again. A figure was crouched in the darkness, dark and almost shapeless. A hooded head jerked in my direction, our gazes meeting for the first time in over 30 years, with just a pane of glass between us. Though its face was hidden in shadow, I knew exactly who, or rather what it was. My breath slowed to a halt as I looked at it. I only discovered that my cup of tea had fallen from my hands when the hot liquid singed my toes. The pinkish glow above, where it was fixated at, jolted me back into reality. My heart froze. Mia's room. Parental instinct overrode any sense of self-preservation as I charged out the door at it. It darted into the cover of the trees bordering our house, tripping over its elongated limbs. It soon slipped out of my sight, far beyond where I could chase it. I didn't find any peace in watching it leave, but a queasy dread pooling within me. This wouldn't be the last time. Something glimmered from the ground, having rolled out of the folds of its cloak. Without even thinking, I picked it up to inspect it. I let out a choking wheeze, almost dropping it. Somehow I managed to hold on, unable to let go of it, no matter how much fear it instilled in me. A single, old, silver dollar. Every seat has been filled. The aisles are empty. We've boarded and taken off, all while a nervous-looking man stands mysteriously at the back of the plane. No one seems to notice him. I do. He was already on when I sat down, in my row at the end of the aisle. Dressed casually, he carried himself with a sullen anxiety that I found unsettling. I hate flying, always have, but still, this felt different. I gave him a once-over. He looked normal enough. I found no reason to be worried, yet his presence perturbed me. I shrugged it off. There wasn't much that I could do. I tried to relax. My mind wandered, and I found myself casually daydreaming about his identity. I imagined that he was a middling cop, nervous about transporting a dangerous criminal. Then he became a repentant lover who had broken through security to proclaim his desires to an ex. Maybe he was a disgruntled former employee waiting to take his vengeance. As the plane filled up and the man took no further action though, my interest waned. I was tired with worry and already sick of the long flight ahead. His presence drained from my mind, and I rested my head against the curved innards of the aircraft and daydreamed instead about nothing at all. At the sound of takeoff, however, my posture straightened and his bloated shape tilted back into the corner of my eye. I felt compelled to look over. There he was, still, with a manner slightly less sullen, but precisely more anxious, standing opposite the bathroom door, staring down the aisle. No crew member came to seat him. I double-checked the seatbelt sign. On. I glanced over at my two rowmates. They didn't seem to notice. Weird. I coyly nudged the armrest of my neighbour, an elderly woman who had been reading the in-flight brochure. She kindly looked up and over at me. I gave a friendly smile and silently gestured towards the man standing behind us. She smiled back, oblivious, and elbowed the old man sitting next to her, who leaned forward, slightly, and donated a half-hearted head nod. Suddenly, the plane lurched forward, and we were thrust back into our seats. I straightened up, slightly unnerved. I could see the man in the corner of my eye. He didn't move. I raised the blinder on the window next to me. The world outside sped up to a blur. I sat upright and popped my head over the seats, looking for a crew member. I saw a stewardess near the middle of the plane, sitting comfortably by the emergency exit door, facing us. She didn't seem to notice the standing man. I glanced out of the window. The runway began to shrink away below us. Still, the man stood. When the seatbelt sign blinked off, I quickly unfastened. I excused myself to the elderly couple and stepped out into the aisle. I was curious. Should I say something? To the man? To the crew? To another passenger? Perhaps he was an air marshal. But weren't they supposed to blend in? The man wore plain clothes, but stood out as everyone sat. Not exactly conspicuous. Maybe he was some kind of inspector for the airline. Maybe for the government. Are you waiting for the bathroom? I asked. He was about my height, though he was slouched slightly against the wall. He had been staring down the aisle, off into the distance, but abruptly glanced my way when questioned. I held my breath in anticipation, only to receive a dismissive headshake. He turned back around and resettled into his distant stare. That was disappointing, I thought. Maybe the daydreams had heightened my expectations. I opened the bathroom door and slunk inside. I was feeling woozy. I splashed some water on my face and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I didn't look great, but that wasn't unusual. I shook my head and walked back out. The man was still standing there, staring down the aisle. A small 3-person procession had formed in the space just outside of the bathroom. I slipped out as an elderly woman slipped in. The 2 older men behind her shambled forward. One met my eyes and gave a polite smile, which I returned. The other had his head down. Neither seemed to acknowledge the standing man. I wondered if they had questioned him as well. I excused myself to the elderly couple in my row and shuffled back down into my window seat. The man still stood just behind us, transfixed by some distant point. No sense of threat seemed to emanate from him though, and I was exhausted, so I slunk down in my chair, closed my eyes, and dozed off. I dreamt of a beautiful summer day in a quiet little town. I walked along the street, alone but content. Fine 2-story brick homes with shingled roofs washed up and down my left side like angular waves, and a long, endless park slithered brightly along my right. There were no cars on the road, parked or moving, but every other house had a vehicle or 2 stationed in the driveway. The park was empty too, though there were a half-dozen or so red and white balloons tied to the bench, which sat just off the sidewalk opposite to me, beside a big oak tree. As I walked, the sun glared above, and I noticed a pair of shoes sticking out from behind the oak tree. They were black with brown tips, and they were pointed directly up towards the sky. As I walked forward, I saw these shoes were connected to a pair of clean grey dress pants, and as I walked further still, I saw that a torso, draped in a pale blue button-up shirt, jutted out from the top of these pants. A rotund gut concealed any further viewing, but it heaved and hoed so as to suggest that a head may rest on either side. Curious, I crossed the street and made my way towards the body. As I approached, the belly began to breathe in heavier exaggerations until I stood directly over a throbbing mass of clothing. I looked down for a face, but no head appeared. Instead, a framed mirror weighed down by a collar of an empty button-up shirt, which now expanded and deflated so intensely that I thought it might explode. I looked into the mirror and saw my own reflection, and then someone else's. I jumped and spun around. No one was there. I looked up. No one. I looked back down. A root from the big oak tree had curled around the mirror's frame and slithered its way into the shirt. The 2 pulsed in rhythm with each other. A strong breeze blew. The big oak tree creaked loudly and swayed in the wind, until it looked like it might fall over. Panicked, I gripped the root woven into the shirt and pulled at it with all my might. I gently awoke. My left elbow tingled and my hand was numb. I rose up in my seat and gave my arm a shake. I looked around. A food cart sauntered forward a few rows up. The elderly lady next to me was reading. Her husband appeared to be asleep. I had to go to the bathroom. I excused myself to my neighbour and carefully pirouetted past her sleeping companion. Still groggy, I shook my head, wiped my brow and looked up, right into the eyes of the standing man. I froze. His eyes were huge, like that of a child, but his face was worn and weathered, and thin strands of pale brown hair fell upon his forehead. He stared right through my soul, more sorrowful than ever, but less anxious than before. He didn't speak. I couldn't speak. I stumbled backwards a little bit, but caught myself on the edge of a seat. I felt shell-shocked. I tried to gather myself, but as I stood up, a cold, heavy force blasted into my backside, hurling me forward. I was barely able to contort my body enough to avoid the man standing in front of me. My back rammed against the bathroom door, and I froze like a prisoner caught in a spotlight. "Oh my God," I heard from the aisle. "I'm so sorry." I turned. The food cart, manned by a distressed-looking stewardess, rattled in the walkway. "I didn't see you. I'm so sorry. I only looked down for a second," she pleaded. "It's all right," I stammered, as I straightened up and tried to compose myself. "I wasn't paying attention. It's my fault." The stewardess furrowed her brow and squinted her eyes. Are you all right?" she asked. "Everything but my pride," I responded dryly. I was shaken up inside, but I didn't want to make a fuss. I composed my outward appearance. I turned to the standing man, contemplating whether or not I should even bother apologizing for the ruckus. He seemed indifferent to the whole situation. He looked ill. Did the stewardess notice? Why didn't she, or anyone else, try to seat him during takeoff? He must have some sort of authority, but he appeared so fragile and sickly. I looked back at the flight attendant to gauge her interest. She didn't seem alarmed. "Excuse me," she said politely, as she began to slowly push the cart forward again. "I need to get by." I gave my head a shake. I opened the bathroom door and slunk away inside. I felt panicked. If the man was sick, he should get help. Someone must have already approached him, though. It's not like he was hiding. The stewardess didn't seem concerned at all. Everything must be under control. Still, I couldn't shake this feeling of impending doom. I wasn't sure what to do. I looked in the mirror to calm myself, but didn't like what I saw. I turned towards the inside of the bathroom door and laid my forehead against it. I put my face in my hands and tried to gather myself. What was I getting so worked up over? Was I getting sick? Was I going crazy? Maybe I'm just hungry. When did I last eat? I strained to remember. The only memory of food that I could resuscitate on the spot was a meal that had taken place at least a few nights earlier. My eyes began to well up as I thought about that dinner. Maybe I was becoming feverish. I rubbed my cheeks. My wife and I had made a roast beef and Yorkshire pudding that night. It was an old family recipe. My parents used to make it for my brothers and I growing up. We made it for our own kids now. My parents had passed away a few years ago. God, I miss them. I couldn't wait for this godforsaken plane ride to be over so that I could see my family again. I was getting flustered. I just needed to eat, I told myself. That special dinner was plentiful, but even something as tender and delicious as a good roast beef can't last a man a lifetime. I resolved to hunt down the food cart that had assaulted me earlier and plunder it with a vengeance. I tossed some water on my face, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the bathroom. I don't know what I was expecting, but there he was, the mystery man just standing there. I need to ask about him too, I thought, for my own sake. He was in the same place he had been this whole time, staring off into the distance. I eyed him cautiously as I searched for the stewardess in the back. She wasn't there. I turned and gazed off into the distance and saw her chatting with a fellow crew member closer to the front of the plane. I took off after them. I passed through a mostly silent field of passengers. Nearly everyone was lost in their own little world. People were sleeping, reading, watching in-flight entertainment. Very few were talking. There was a hushed air about the cabin. Most seemed to be travelling alone. I noticed that a majority of the plane's population were elderly. 3 or 4 middle-aged individuals stood out, as did a few unaccompanied youths. A cloth-wrapped infant was being rocked to sleep by a young woman in an aisle seat, and 3 young men, outfitted in army attire, quietly joked around near the emergency exits. The rest of the plane, however, was decidedly more aged and reserved. Was I headed to Florida? I genuinely couldn't remember. "Can I help you?" The 2 flight attendants suddenly stood before me. Yeah, sorry," I stammered, jolted out of my inquisitive reverie. "Is it too late to order some food?" I asked, feeling a little faint. "It is, unfortunately," answered the stewardess. "We're about to make our descent." I was surprised. For some reason, I had expected a lengthier flight. Maybe I'd slept for longer than I realized. "You should return to your seat," she smiled. "The seatbelt sign will be turning on momentarily." "Okay," I yielded. I turned around and looked down the aisle. The standing man stared back. Actually, can I ask you a question?" I said, turning back around. "Yes, sir," responded the stewardess politely. I wasn't exactly sure what to say, or how to put it. I gathered myself once again. Well, do you see that man standing outside the bathroom?" I asked, pointing back up the aisle towards him. I immediately regretted my approach. What if I was actually going crazy? What if I had a fever and was hallucinating? I didn't want to scare anyone. If I was pointing towards a piece of empty space and proclaiming an invisible man was harassing me, then this flight was going to get really tense for everyone, really fast. You can never rest when the maniac is in your midst. "Yes," replied the stewardess. "Oh," I blurted out. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more worried. I'd seriously considered that she might not be able to see him. "Well, he's been standing outside the bathroom since takeoff. I don't know if he's ill or if he's a special part of the crew or something. I don't know, but he hasn't sat down once since I boarded. He doesn't look well either. He looks worried and sickly and hasn't been responsive. Is he part of the crew?" "No," replied the stewardess. "Oh, well, I mean, shouldn't we help him to his seat then? If we're about to land, he should be seated, right?" I was sweating a little by now, and more worried than before. None of this really made any sense. "And where do you suggest we seat him, sir?" replied the stewardess firmly. "What?" I asked, genuinely shocked by the flippancy of her response. I turned around and looked for an empty seat. Surely there was one. How else would he have gotten on the plane? If he wasn't part of the crew, he needed a ticket. A ticket would have a seat. I frantically looked around. Every seat was filled, except for mine. I began to sweat profusely. I felt fevered and exhausted. A tinge of adrenaline rushed through my body. I looked up and out again at the mystery man. He stared back. I turned to the flight attendant. "What do you mean? He doesn't have a seat? Did you check his ticket? How did he get on board? What's he going to do while we land?" I was becoming frantic. "You could give him your seat," suggested the stewardess matter-of-factly. "But," I mumbled, "then where would I sit?" She didn't respond. I looked helplessly at the other flight attendant, a steward. He said nothing. I felt like I was going to be sick to my stomach. I needed to sit down. I wondered who looked worse right now, me or the standing man. Should I give him my seat? I looked up at him. Even from far away, I could see that he looked gravely ill. No one was helping him. No one was helping either of us. "I need to sit," I uttered. I felt like I was about to lose consciousness. "It's you or him," I heard. "Why?" I whispered. "There's only one seat left," someone said, "and he's here for yours." My stomach dropped the full 7 miles below my feet. My vision blurred and my body felt faint. I turned around, back towards the mysterious man. What the hell was going on? I tried to shout, but nothing came out. I grabbed the edges of the surrounding seat and pulled myself towards him. I needed to get back to my seat. I picked up steam and drew near, but still, he did not move. "Don't take my seat," I sputtered out. No one paid us any attention. I reached the last row, almost on my knees. I gripped the top of a seat and pulled myself up. I stood for a second, facing down my row, towards my empty seat, and then fainted sideways, directly onto the standing man. I felt no contact until I hit the ground. My eyes were closed, but I felt the cold, hard fabric of the airplane carpet rub against my cheek. I laid there, exhausted. Terrified, I mustered what strength I could and clumsily pushed myself up onto my knees. I kneeled for a second, turned away from the action, and tried to catch my breath. I felt as heavy as a mountain. Slowly, I pushed my way back onto my feet, leaning against the cold plastic wall for support. I turned around, labored and out of breath, and looked forward. The man was gone. I became frozen in fear. In the corner of my eye, I could see someone in my chair, with thin strands of pale brown hair strewn over huge eyes, staring at me. In the distance of the aisle, lights began to shut off, leaving only pure and eternal darkness in their wake. One by one, they clicked off as the darkness raced towards me, until a final click enveloped everything in black. I woke up on my back with a bright light shining on my face. "Doctor?" I heard a soft, distant voice ask. "He's waking up." I tried to raise my left hand to shade my eye, but it was weighed down by a thick tube which slid from the side of my bed to a mask on my mouth. I took a deep breath and felt an incredible soreness in my chest. I coughed. It hurt so much that I instinctively tried to retreat over the side of the bed. A firm hand grasped my shoulder and kept me in place. "Easy now," said a reassuring voice. "You're going to be all right." I heard a door open. Someone gasped. "Daddy?" A voice half whispered, half yelled. A child rushed over to the side of my bed, followed cautiously by a woman holding an infant. They all looked familiar. It was my family. "He might not have the strength to speak right now, but the operation was successful," explained the reassuring voice. "He's got a new pair of lungs and a heart, all from the same donor. They were made available late last night and rushed over just in time for an emergency surgery." Someone began to cry. They sounded grateful. I felt the warm weight of a child rest gently on my shoulder and a loving hand grasp mine. I held both with all my strength and dozed off contently. At Christmas, we had a recreation of what we had once thought was going to be my last meal: roast beef and Yorkshire pudding. Everyone was invited. Extended family from all over the country poured into our home to celebrate. Longtime friends stopped by early in the evening. on the way to family dinners of their own, to offer their congratulations and express their joy and relief at my recovery. Near the end of the night, after all the memories and laughter had been given their time and our bellies were full and people started to slowly drain out, I took my brothers and young son upstairs to my home office for our traditional Christmas time glass of bourbon. I poured each a cup as I looked fondly over framed pictures that cluttered the room. "Is that him?" I heard. I looked up and directed my attention to a photo that was suspended just off to the right and just above a large family portrait that hung as a centerpiece on the wall across from my desk. "Yep, that's our savior," I said, looking down at my baby boy asleep in my arms. I kissed his forehead and smiled gratefully. "Well, salute," declared my brother. "Salute," we all chanted, raising our glasses. And then we had a drink for the man in the picture on my wall, a man who none of us had ever met. He smiled gently from a boat somewhere out at sea, with his brown hair windswept to the side and a child, half in frame, sitting precariously on his lap. His face was filled with excitement and amusement as he held up a significant-looking fish by the hook with his left hand. You could see the reflection of his wife taking the picture in his eyes. They were so big. My grandfather stormed Iwo Jima. At 19 years old, he stepped foot on an 8-mile long, 3-mile wide slab of volcanic rock that would become one of the bloodiest battlegrounds in American history. Overlooking the island, there was a 550-foot mountain known as Mount Suribachi, named due to its resemblance to a Japanese grinding bowl. The Japanese had prepared for the invasion for months. By the time the Marine Corps had landed on the island, the Japanese had an unspeakably vast array of artillery, machine guns, and mines defending the island. Most of the artillery was dug into the side of the mountain overlooking the island. Mount Grinding Bowl was a strangely suiting name for the situation. Every inch of ground gained by the Marines would cost them blood. The island has since become hallowed ground for the Marine Corps. Every square inch holds 1,000 stories of the titanic struggle between the empire of the rising sun and the sleeping giant that was the United States. Thousands of lives were lost there. And while the battlefield on the surface of the island has since cleaned up and recovered, old bones still haunt the island beneath the surface. My grandfather, shortly before his passing, told me of the fight for Mount Suribachi. Most people know of that mountain because of the timeless photograph of the flag raising. The photograph would prompt Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal to declare, "The raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years. But the battle for Suribachi that my father told me did not take place on top of the mountain, but beneath it. As the Marines began climbing the mountain, fighting for every square inch of ground, my grandfather's squad took to the tunnels. The Japanese had constructed many of miles of tunnels and spider holes beneath the island. The tunnels connected the dozens of artillery positions, machine gun nests, and thousands of spider holes. The Japanese soldiers would pop up at the most unexpected places at the most unexpected times, fire a few shots, throw a couple of grenades, and disappear back into the earth. Many Marine squads had at least one individual armed with a flamethrower that would be used to clear the tunnels and bunkers. My grandfather's squad did not have one, however. They came to a tunnel entrance near the base of the mountain. They tossed a few grenades in and waited until after the explosions to enter. Armed with their rifles and carbines and a few handheld flashlights, they dove into the tunnel system. My grandfather, only a 19-year-old lance corporal, still with acne on his face was Point Man, the first to enter the tunnel. The tunnel was wide enough for two individuals to stand side by side. Immediately upon entering, 3 Japanese soldiers charged them with bayonets. My grandfather dropped the first with his M1 carbine. The second and third Japanese soldier were killed by shots from an M1 Garand from the Marine to my grandfather's left. That Marine was Corporal Whitehorse. Whitehorse was infamous for his homemade moonshine he would make from raisins the Marines would occasionally receive from their rations. They continued farther into the tunnels. Occasionally, the ground would shake and dust would fall from the roof as the naval artillery pounded targets on the island into oblivion. Sometimes, they would hear the thunderous report of the Japanese's own artillery as they answered from bunkers dug into the mountainside. That was my grandfather's squad's mission, to find and neutralize the Japanese artillery that was too well protected from naval bombardment. The battle was in full pitch. Hundreds of men were dying all around them. They came to many forks and splits in the underground system. Each new passageway had to be cleared. The Marines took contact from fanatical Japanese soldiers many times. Each time, the Japanese soldiers were dropped by effective and accurate fire from the squad of Marines. Further and further, they delved into the belly of the mountain. What seemed like hours later, my grandfather and his squad came to a chamber carved out of the rock. In the chamber lay 2 surgical tables, dried blood and gore still pooled on the tables and floor surrounding them. A gurney with dozens of wicked and nefarious surgical instruments gleamed under the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. A table by the wall held a sheaf of papers and folders, all written in Japanese. The Marines, although spooked by this macabre setting, collected the papers, which likely held valuable intel, and moved deeper still. Suddenly, they heard an unholy scream. My grandfather described it as something between a mountain lion and a man in pain. A minute or two after hearing the ungodly sound, they came to a fork in the passage. Out of the left-hand tunnel came a creature born out of the devil's fever dream. A tangle of bone and sinew, shaped like a pair of spiders attached to their backs, lunged at them. It leapt through the air as the Marines fired upon the thing and landed on Corporal Whitehouse, knocking my grandfather down to the side. It tore and stabbed at the corporal with pieces of broken and protruding bone. The Marine screamed and flailed beneath the creature. It opened its horridly malformed mouth and bit down on his head. With a wet crunch, Corporal Whitehouse's screams abruptly ceased. The Marines kept firing at the beast. My grandfather said he could see the bullets hitting their mark as pieces of the creature flew off and holes punched into its body. The kind of firepower they threw at the thing would have brought down a bear. With every shot that hit its mark, the creature flinched and took a step back. Finally, it screamed at the Marines and retreated back into the tunnels. Whitehorse was all too obviously dead. They collected his dog tags and moved on. My grandfather told me he would be lying if he said they all were not scared out of their minds. They came to another chamber in the tunnels, this one smaller than the first. They smelled it long before they came to it though. The stench of decay caused many of them to double over and vomit. When they found that chamber, they were all thankful they had nothing left in their stomachs to toss up. It was filled, packed with mutilated, rotting corpses. Most were skinned, dried flesh gleaming dully in the glow of their flashlights. Many were headless, others were missing their limbs. One was sawed neatly in half lengthwise. Some were cut apart and sewn back together at odd angles. But the body that stuck out to my grandfather the most was one that was once a kid. The kid appeared to be Chinese. He was not mutilated like the others were. Instead, he lay there with simply a small hole in his forehead. The squad leader, a gruff and crusty and what they thought was an old man that was only 26 years old, named Sergeant Mayers, declared that they were going to get out of those godforsaken tunnels right then and there. With the trail of spent brass, bullet holes, and bodies they had been leaving, it shouldn't have been hard to find their way out. They began backtracking. They reached the spot where Whitehorse had been killed and found that creature crouched over his lifeless body, eating him. My grandfather screamed in righteous fury and let loose with his carbine, emptying an entire magazine into the creature. It screamed, leapt up into the air, and latched onto the roof of the tunnel. It scurried towards them with unnerving speed and agility. It dropped onto my grandfather, impaling his right thigh with a piece of broken bone that served as the tip of one of its legs. My grandfather fought with all his might to keep the thing from stabbing and tearing him to death. He became washed over with a stench of death and rot that clung to the creature as he dodged its multiple limbs. His squad mates, afraid of accidentally shooting my grandfather, held their fire. Sergeant Mayers charged the beast and clubbed it with the buttstock of his M1 Garand. It raised its head at him and let loose an ear-shattering scream, revealing multiple rows of human teeth as it did so. Sergeant Mayers kept beating it. It lunged forward with its front limbs extended and impaled Sergeant Mayers through the abdomen. He dropped to his knees. Then, as it reared back, its jaws open, preparing to bite down on Sergeant Mayers' head and finish the job, the other Marines let loose a volley of fire. The creature spun around again and again, its razor-sharp limbs flailing wildly. It slashed one Marine across the stomach and slammed another into the tunnel wall. My grandfather got up and limped to Whitehorse's body and rummaged through his pack. At the bottom, wrapped in layers of cloth, was a bottle of Whitehorse's moonshine. My grandfather grabbed it and a shred of cloth. He uncorked the bottle and stuffed the opening with a cloth, leaving some hanging out. He lit the cloth and threw it at the nightmare creature. The creature went up in flames with a horrid, long, drawn-out shriek of mindless agony. It sprinted into the adjacent tunnel and disappeared, screaming until the sounds of the raging battle outside the tunnels drowned it out. The remaining Marines collected their wounded and dead and made their way back out of the tunnel systems. Sergeant Mayers had bled out before they reached the entrance of the tunnels. Eventually, they reached the daylight once again. They limped their way to a temporary forward HQ set up on a beachhead. A captain had seen them stumbling up to the HQ and immediately called for medical assistance. The Marine officers were skeptical of what my grandfather and his squad mates told him about their encounter in the tunnels. He and the other wounded Marines in his squad were loaded onto a landing boat and taken to a ship for medical treatment. The wound in my grandfather's leg was becoming infected with unusual rapidity. Already, the ships around the island were becoming crowded with dead and wounded Marines. A few days later, aboard that same ship, he watched the American flag raise on the summit of Mount Suribachi. He said the triumphant roar from the thousands of Marines and sailors as the foreign flag was raised over Japan home territory for the first time in over 1,000 years was enough to shake the pearly gates of heaven. My grandfather was given a Purple Heart for wounds received from a Japanese bayonet and diagnosed with battle fatigue. We now refer to it as PTSD, and sent back to the States. The surviving Marines from his squad were given the same diagnosis. My grandfather was tough, mentally and physically. He denied and contested the diagnosis of PTSD until his dying day, but said the shrieks and screams and the stench of that monster still haunted him. In my heart, I know he encountered something beneath the blood-soaked sand of Iwo Jima. War is hell. Something is off about the sky. It's foggy and yellow, like the kind that warns a tornado is coming, but there is no bad weather in the forecast. We thought this odd, considering it was the middle of July and we live in California. Rain in the summertime is rare, but the sky just looks off. We stood on the balcony of our home for a few minutes, looking out to the backyard, silently sipping coffee and taking in the morning. Then went on with our regular daily schedules. I work for a small brewery in the sales department, and my wife is an English teacher at the high school. We lead relatively boring lives, home by 6 and in bed by 10, occasionally going out on a Thursday night for drinks with friends. We're safe people and like to live by the rules. "Honey, can you see if I left my black shoes by the door?" My wife called down from our bedroom. I set my spatula down and walked over to the back door. "Yep, right here," I called back up. I returned to my eggs and finished making breakfast. This was our normal morning routine. I made breakfast for my wife, who leaves the house very early, then go on a run. She flew downstairs and apologized for taking her meal to go. "Late," was all she said as she grabbed a paper plate and kissed me on the cheek. "Love you," she called back to me halfway out the door. "Love you too," I replied to the closed door. I washed up the dishes and put on my running shoes, grabbing my headphones as I walked out the door. Early morning runs are my favorite time of day. It's so quiet, the city not quite awake yet. I started my playlist and headed down the driveway to my favorite jogging path a few blocks away. It was more humid than usual, and the sky was still spooky. I passed the usual people on the trail, giving tense smiles as I focused on my breathing. All was fine, until I tripped over something and hit the ground hard. "What the hell?" I murmured as I drew my knee up to examine the quickly bleeding gash. I looked around to see what I had tripped on and saw a leg sticking out of the bushes lining the path. I stood up and peeked over the top of the bushes. There was a teenage kid laying down, staring straight up at the sky, unblinking, with a creepy grin on his face. I nudged this leg with my foot. "Hey kid, are you alright?" I asked. He didn't move, only smiled wider. His pupils were completely dilated, and he had dried blood on his upper lip, like his nose had been bleeding. "Check out the full moon," he whispered. Confused, I glanced up at the foggy sky. "The clouds are too thick, and it's 7:30 in the morning," I told the kid. "It's a beauty," he responded, and continued staring upward. I looked around for help, but the trail was empty. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed 911. I quickly explained the situation, that there was a kid laying down under some bushes and something seemed really off. The dispatcher asked me to stay with him until someone arrived. A few minutes later, I saw a pair of police officers walk around the corner, heading over to us. "What's going on here?" one of them asked. "I don't really know, sir," I replied. "I was jogging and tripped over his foot," I explained, showing him my bloody knees. They knelt down and started checking out the kid, trying to get him to talk. "Has he been responsive?" the other asked. "Not really. He told me to look at the moon, but that's all he's done, I said. They both shot straight up and looked at me. What were his exact words? They asked at the same time. I stammered, suddenly nervous. He said to look at the full moon or something like that. I don't remember. One of them knelt back down and mumbled something into his radio. Thank you, sir. Have a nice day, the other said, and kneeled down next to his partner. You're welcome, I said, as I started limping down the path back towards my house. I texted my wife and briefly told her what happened. She texted back almost immediately, saying that it was one of her students that had been missing since the morning before. I'm glad you found him. His parents were a wreck when they called this morning to see if he'd shown up to class, she texted. I made my way home and showered the blood and dirt off my knees, then slapped some band-aids on. It was Friday, my day off. Saturdays were our busy days at the brewery, so I kicked up my feet and turned on the TV, ready to relax before my busy weekend. The news popped up with a message saying that there would be a citywide curfew of 8:30 p.m. right when night falls. That's weird, I thought. How the hell are they going to implement that? And why? I tried to research the curfew, but nothing else came up. I went back to watching TV and surfing the internet. That was about all I did all day until my wife got home around 4:30. She came and sat next to me on the couch and we talked about her student. Did you hear anything else about that kid? I asked her. No, he was taken to some psychiatric facility after you found him though, because all he would say was to look at the moon. I wonder what happened to him. He's one of my brightest students, she said, concerned. The police officers got really weird when I said he was talking about the moon, like they knew something I didn't. Also, did you see that there's apparently a citywide curfew? Yeah, one of my colleagues showed us an alert on a phone. I wonder what that's about. I tried to look it up, but there weren't any articles about it. I have no idea. Anyway, what are you feeling for dinner? After dinner, we settled on the couch. She started working on grading papers, and I finished up the paperwork for our monthly budget meeting tomorrow morning. The news was playing in the background, but suddenly started making a loud alert noise. Curfew lifted, started flashing across the bottom of the screen. It looked different than the alert earlier in the day. This one was bright red and stationary, instead of scrolling across the bottom of the screen like announcements usually do. Well, alright then, my wife mused, before stacking the papers on the side table. That's it for me. I'm going to bed, she said, and got up off the couch. I'm right behind you, I said, closing my laptop and following her upstairs. My wife fell asleep quickly, but I was restless. I scrolled on my phone for a while and fell asleep at some point with my phone laying next to me on the pillow. At 3:14 a.m., an Amber Alert type noise started going off, ripping me out of my sleep. I groggily searched for my phone and turned off the sound, trying to adjust the bright screen. Do not look at the moon. Stay indoors. In all caps is what the alert said. I had dozens of texts and social media messages underneath the alert, all saying, check out the full moon tonight. It's beautiful. What the hell is going on, I thought. Confused and sleepy, I rolled over to see if the alert woke my wife, but her side of the bed was empty. I started to worry, thinking about the curfew and weird alert. I got out of bed and wandered around the house, trying to see where she went. I found her, standing on the balcony. I panicked, remembering the alert on my phone, and ran to her, head ducked low. I stood between her and the railing, facing the house. I lifted my head just enough to see her face. Her eyes were wide, pupils completely dilated, fixated upward toward the sky. She had a horrible smile on her face, and her nose was bleeding badly. "Check out the full moon tonight, honey," she whispered in a raspy voice that was not her own. "It's a beauty." I was shocked. "What is happening?" I asked her, shaking her slightly. "What's wrong? Why are you bleeding? Are you hurt?" I kept pressing. She didn't answer, just kept her eyes fixated on the moon. I didn't know what to do. I glanced around the patio, looking for a chair to sit on, when my eyes passed a reflection of the moon in the glass door. I froze, unable to look away from the bright, beautiful moon. I slowly turned around and stood side by side with my wife, staring straight at the moon. My eyes were aching, and I could feel the blood running down my chin from my nose. But I didn't care. I'd never seen anything more beautiful than that moon. There were helicopters buzzing overhead, and I could hear men shouting. But I just couldn't look away from the moon. It sure is a beauty. I seriously feel like something is wrong with the world right now. I'm not gonna lie, I'm beginning to doubt anything happened. But I can't. The memories are way too vivid, and I'm still feeling shocked and terrified. But I'm getting ahead of myself. And maybe you people can help me make sense of this before I lose my mind. This all happened over the weekend. It's summer break, and since I can't find a job, I just chill at my apartment playing Overwatch or FF14 for the most part, blinds closed, taking a good toke here and there. But luckily, my best friend and roommate Alex was staying for the summer, so I wasn't going to get bored out of my mind. Plus, he has a car. So, this past Saturday, he, his girlfriend Erin, and I decided to go visit this abandoned old hospital off some railroad tracks in rural Idaho that a lot of people keep telling us to go visit since we like urban exploration and whatnot. It was a nice early afternoon, and we'd just gotten lunch when we arrived there. It started off as any regular old abandoned building visit, ignoring the warning signs that stay out, wandering around the old hallways and checking out the rooms where the equipment has been left to gather dust, taking photos here and there. It wasn't even a large hospital to begin with, so it was hard to get lost, if at all. Alex stumbled upon what seemed like a conference room on the second floor. He yelled for me and Erin to go in, so we did because it meant he must have found something cool that was out of the ordinary. And hell, out of the ordinary it was, but totally not cool. Not even in the slightest. On a bunch of whiteboards hung a load of Polaroid photos on magnets. And I mean a load. The entire 2 segments of whiteboard on one wall and a smaller one to the side were full of these Polaroids. I mean, I know Polaroids themselves are not scary, but the photos. They were photos of people, bound and gagged. Some of them, the people were heavily bruised, bleeding, like they took the worst beating imaginable without succumbing to sweet death. That made my blood curdle. Alex took out his smartphone to take a video. I remember him saying, "This is so screwed up, but so cool, like some messed up modern urban art piece or something." Of course he would say that. He was studying art after all. But man, I wish he wasn't being himself at that moment, because I wanted to nope right out of there. But he insisted we stayed. I remember telling him that we need to go, maybe even call the cops, but he teasingly told me to stop being such a wuss. I still cannot understand why in the world he wasn't treating it seriously. I know he was a very chill dude, but holy hell did those photos look real, that if they were faked, whoever did the makeup should win an Oscar. He finally relented when his girlfriend, who was walking around looking at the photos on the other board, said, "Guys, come here." The way she said it should have been the last red flag. Her voice just seemed flat, but terrified at the same time. Alex and I made our way to the board she was at, and she pointed at one photo, then another, then another. I did my best to follow quickly, but I could not stop staring at the first photo. It was a photo of all three of us, all bound up, naked, bruised and severely battered, probably just within a few inches of our lives. I was literally staring at my terrified face, covered in tears, sweat, blood and drool. I must have cursed 50 times under my breath as I looked at the other photos. They were photos of us under different stages of torture. I do not even want to remember what those photos looked like. I shudder every time they force their way into my consciousness. None of us remember ever having been through something like that, and I am certain none of us were into some kinky bondage stuff either. Whatever this was, it was seriously messed up, and it was screwing with my head. "What the hell?" said Alex. He was still taking a video. I think he was beginning to finally believe that there was something seriously wrong about this. "I think Joey was right. We gotta get out of here," said Erin, tugging at both of our arms. I thought about calling the cops, so I reached to grab my phone, when suddenly, the otherwise silent, now eerily so, abandoned hospital was filled with the sounds of heavy footsteps, like someone was wearing some crazy, industrial-grade steel-toed boots. We were pretty sure we were alone, so the only other option was to run. And did we run? Alex grabbed me by the arm, and his hand held Erin's, who was leading the way. We couldn't have been in there longer than an hour, but it was pitch black outside every window we looked out of as we rushed down the hallway to the stairs. But what messed with me was the fact that the indoors were lit with a light from what should have been the sunshine outside the windows. But there was no sunshine, only pitch black darkness. No matter which way we went, it seemed like we were met with just more hallways and dark windows. The sounds of footsteps kept in close chase, and sometimes I could swear I could see someone, or something, hulking behind us at the corner of my eye whenever we turned down a hallway. This was a terrible time to not be in good shape, because my sides were hurting so bad, but I couldn't stop running. Not only because I was scared witless, but Alex's grip on my wrist was so tight I don't think I could have slipped away to take a breath. I felt like I was going to pass out when all of a sudden, we stopped running. Thoughts were racing through my head. Was Alex tired now too? Was the creepy figure in front of us? I panted and gasped for as much air as I could when Alex put his arm on my shoulder and motioned for me to be quiet. Everything was silent again. There were no footsteps any longer, and the hallway was normal again. And the windows. Oh, the windows. I've never felt the desire for sunshine pouring through windows in a long while. We could see the door that led to the stairs and bolted through it and down. When we got to the reception area, we paused again. One of the doors was wide open. Damn, was someone messing with us? Was it the guy upstairs? I thought to myself as I approached the front door. Alex and Erin seemed to be alright. As I remember, they both sighed in relief. Walking outside into the hot sun was almost like walking into paradise after stumbling through the 7 circles of hell. I never thought I would miss the sun this much, until I heard the door slam behind me. Damn, Alex and Erin was still in there, and I could hear the footsteps again as Alex and Erin frantically knocked on the door, jiggling the handle as I tried to pry the door open. But some ungodly force was keeping the door shut. It wasn't even budging. "It's here, oh my god, what the hell, what the hell, what the hell?" Alex was frantically yelling as Erin's screams pierced through the door, pleading for me to help them. I tried to look around. Maybe there was a window they could climb out of. But inside every window I could peer in, with my hand clasped at the door handle, was dark. Just like the blackness I saw when we were inside trying to look out. Damn. I kept knocking and yanking as they kept yelling when suddenly all sound stopped other than my jiggling of the door handle and knocking. "Alex? Erin? Are you alright?" I remember asking. "Hello? Anyone? Please tell me this is a joke." It wasn't. It just happened all of a sudden. It was like 100 pair of hands were knocking on the front door as I heard Alex and Erin scream, the most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard in my life. I think my brain just went on autopilot and noped out of there. I booked it as fast as I thought I could possibly run. I couldn't use the car because Alex had the keys, so I just ran and ran and ran, up until I got to a gas station. It must have been sunset when I got there, and passed out. That's as much as I can remember, up until waking up in a hospital bed. The first thing I remember seeing was my friend Candice through the glass talking to some cop. I felt sore all around, looking at my arms, wiggling my toes. Other than a few scrapes and bruises here and there, I felt alright. When I looked back up, Candice was inside with the cops. "Are you doing alright, Joseph?" asked one of the cops. "I'm Officer McLaughlin, and this is my partner, Officer Merrill. We would like to ask you a few questions." Damn, they would think I was insane. You guys might think I was being a coward, and I was, abandoning my best friend and his girl. But honestly, my brain was just a jumbled mess. So, I tried to tell them as much as possible with as little information needed without sounding insane. I told them we went exploring in this old hospital, and I told them I knew it was illegal, and I don't even remember much of what I told them, to be honest. I knew I wove some lie because I knew they wouldn't believe if I told them even just half the truth. But Alex and Erin, though. I remember telling them that I got lost in the hospital and I tried to find Alex and Erin, but they were nowhere to be found. The car was there, but they weren't. And it was beginning to get late, so I just jogged back, but was severely under shape and probably dehydrated, so I passed out. Maybe we could get a missing person report on them and go back to the hospital? I don't know. I did my best. But they believed me. At least I think they did, because they told me to get some rest. I was passed out most of Sunday. I think my brain just didn't want to process what had happened. Monday morning, I received a call from the cops in the hospital. It was regarding Alex and Erin. They told me that they tried to look up Alex and Erin to try find a way to contact them or put out a missing persons profile since they haven't contacted me or anyone. But they told me they couldn't find any info on them. Not through social media or the school. The hell? They told me to meet them at the station if I was playing a prank on them. As soon as I got dressed, I called my friend Candice to come pick me up from the hospital. As soon as we headed out for the station, which wasn't very far, I told her about what the cops told me about Alex and Erin. Who are Alex and Erin? What the hell? Was Candice messing with me? She couldn't have. She was definitely not the type. When we got to the station, I basically got interrogated by the cops because I was telling them I told them the truth about Alex and Erin, and they were telling me I was lying. I finally asked them if I can get onto Facebook to show them Alex and Erin's profile and show them pictures of them because, for real, I was getting frantic, desperate, but most of all, terrified. I logged in and typed Alex's name into the search bar. A bunch of other Alexes with the same last name showed up, but not my Alex. I tried to look up Erin. Same deal. I went to my photos. I know I have at least a few photos with the two of them since I spent a ton of time with Alex. Nothing. Even the photographs I knew for certain I took with either or both of them. I was either alone or the group of people were condensed in the photo to make up for the missing Alex or Erin. I felt like passing out, and Candice came up with a good excuse to the cops about me probably being delirious because of heat exhaustion or whatever it was. I recall her taking me home to my apartment. Honestly, I don't know what to think anymore. When I got home, all of Alex's belongings were gone. His myriad of books that were usually on the floor, his gaming PC, all of his artwork, gone. It was just empty. His side of the apartment was empty. Honestly, at that point, I just smoked as much green as possible and passed out. It's Tuesday. My apartment manager just came by to let me know she heard of the incident and that if I needed anything, to let her know. She also left me with an envelope addressed to me with no return address. Not thinking much of it, I opened it up. It was Polaroids. Polaroids of my best friend Alex and Erin, bound up, naked, bruised, battered, beaten, with a look of terror in their eyes, almost begging to die. I killed Jacqueline. I killed my girlfriend. But I killed her because she was going to kill you. All of you. The world was going to end if Jacqueline went out that door. I'm going to burn my house down, with myself inside. I'm drinking all the vodka I can handle, then covering this place in gasoline. But first, I'm going to finish this note, so I can tell you what happened. You won't believe me. I hope you don't. Because if you believe me, then that means there's evidence. If there's evidence, that means some of it survived. And that means you're screwed. My name is Kevin Gillard. I'm an entrepreneur. You know what? Screw it. I don't have to tell you extraneous details. I just hiked the entire Appalachian Trail, started in Georgia and ended up here. 50 miles from the end of the trail here in Maine, I found the chamber. Northern Maine is incredibly isolated. You can walk for a week without a sign of human habitation. That's why it was so strange, while the other head of me rose to Mount Katahdin, that I saw a brick. Covered in a light layer of moss, it lay half hidden under a tree root. Curiosity beckoned me to it. After months in the wild, seeing only the occasional town, Straight lines hold a magnetic rarity. Also, there was the confusing question of why a brick would be in an isolated stretch of forest. No buildings stood anywhere nearby. I dislodged the brick from the tree root and dusted off the surface. It was grey, carved out of the same stone composing the boulders scattered nearby. An obscure, vaguely sinister carving twisted across one side of the brick. Sometimes you look back on a thought from your past, and it's like it wasn't even you that had it. How could I have ever even thought that? That's not me. No, in retrospect, your past self becomes delusional, even schizophrenic. I'm experiencing that now. My fascination with the brick was idiotic. I was 50 miles from finishing the most iconic hiking trail in America, and I decided to hunt for the source of a damn block. Not only was it an asinine misordering of priorities, but there were warning signs everywhere. The occult symbol carved into the stone, the goosebumps on my arm, the fact that a brick shouldn't be in the middle of desolate wilderness. I ignored all these things and walked away from the trail. It would prove to be the worst decision I've ever made in my life, which is about to end after 28 short years. The trees grew much heavier away from the trail, stifling the sky with a thick canopy of needles. I spent an hour or two stumbling around, looking for anything interesting, before I realized I was lost. However, I'm an experienced outdoorsman. It didn't take long to ascertain the direction of the trail with my compass and begin to ascend the rocky ground. A relief that I didn't know I needed washed through me then. The subtle weirdness I'd felt in the forest seemed to melt away as the slope tilted into the sky. I perched on a ridge and spied the trail only a few hundred feet away. But in the other direction, I saw something else. A doorway. An inky rectangle in the wall of a ravine, impossible to spot from anywhere except my position. The hairs on my neck raised themselves, a warning from my subconscious mind. I deliberated with myself on top of that ridge. You're almost done. 2 more days until you finish. Don't get distracted. Exploration is the reason why you like the outdoors. You will always wonder what was in there if you don't at least peek right now. The human brain is such a strange entity, engaged in an endless struggle with itself alone. It's brilliantly innovative, yet full of self-deception and faulty processes. Etched with both the innate drive to survive and a sick attraction to danger. Every mind is a whirring contradiction. Eventually, my whirring contradiction made the choice to explore the door. As I clambered down over rocks, I noticed the breeze of early autumn wafting through the ravine. I'd entered the trail in March, counting on the southern air of Georgia to keep me warm. Now, September had crept over Maine, and at the edges of the days, the weather began to chill. My goosebumps intensified when I finally stood in front of the door. A stone hallway extended far under the rocks, dry air swirling slowly out of the darkness as if the mountain itself was exhaling. As I gazed into the murk, I felt that consistent, gnawing fear grow stronger. This is a bad idea, I remember thinking several times. I grabbed my flashlight from my pack and walked into the passage. It was narrow but high, and seemed to stretch on forever. After 5 minutes or so, I saw a single brick lying on the floor, identical to the one I'd found in the woods. The beam of my light fell on a familiar symbol. I ignored the brick and kept going. The deeper I wandered into the mountain, the more bricks appeared. You must think I'm an idiot, right? I know I was acting like one. Believe me, I know. Regret courses through me every second. When I smell the air in my house, when I see the paws in my hand, when I glance backwards at Jacqueline's body. I'm just going to stop criticizing myself and write what happened. I don't know how much time I have. My fingers are shaking and I feel things shifting within me. Okay, back to it. Eventually, bricks covered the stone walls and the passage began to widen. When a sliver of the setting sun glinted far ahead, I thought I'd made it to an exit. It wasn't an exit. The hallway spilled into a vast, circular chamber, a dome of epic proportions. An orange window of burning evening sky was visible on the ceiling, over 100 feet above me, and in the chamber were stone structures. A dais lay in the middle of the room, where a beam of fading sunlight held dust motes aloft. Pillars stood sentinel on the edges, strange etchings in their blocks, and on the inside of the dome, carved into the arches that rose to the window above me, was an abomination. On first glance, there seemed to be many individual statues entwined with each other across the ceiling in a mad dance. But a closer look revealed that the carving was all one thing, an intricate mass of biological chaos, of organic tendrils and growths. I can't describe it accurately. The stone looked alive, but it was moving ever so slightly in the edges of my vision. I know it wasn't, but let me put it this way. Nobody could stand encircled by that horrific carving and feel okay. It did weird things to the mind. Strange patterns hijacked my senses. I was preparing to leave in fear and haste when I saw the body. Well, less of a body than a crumpled mass, ancient and shriveled. It rested behind the far side of the dais, kneeling as if in prayer. I could feel my limbs shaking, but I had to see it. Maybe it was a prop. Maybe this was some kind of elaborate movie set. It wasn't. When I nudged the body with my foot, it slumped sideways with a dry thud. Grey flakes rose and settled from the corpse. That's when I noticed the box. It was black, metal, simple, not much larger than the bricks. The body had knelt before it, skeletal fingers intertwined into worship to it. Once again, I made a choice that was rational in the abstract and foolish in context. I grabbed the box and stuffed it in my pack. Now I'd have proof that this strange chamber existed, and maybe I could figure out more when I returned home. I could tell the authorities about the ancient body and accompany archaeologists as they explored my discovery. I turned my back on the body and stepped into the tunnel. I expected my unease and fear to dissipate. The mystery was over. The suspense was gone. But as I walked, a sickening pressure of dread pressed against my back, emanating from the chamber. It felt like something was watching me from that room, following me, latching onto me. I swear to God, there were whispers behind me. Never words, but sounds. Or maybe they were in my head. I started sprinting. I felt like a fool while doing it, but when I finally escaped, panting in the cool night air, it felt like I'd crawled through a coffin, an exit from the underground chamber that reeked of death. I walked far, far away from that dark doorway. I made my way back to the trail and walked 5 miles up the mountain, bathed in the silver light of an enormous moon, before I pitched my tent and fell asleep. I dreamt of grey dust and muted sobs. Over the next few days, I calmed down considerably. I tried to open the box, but the lid refused to budge. I couldn't tell if anything was inside it, but I figured I'd just find out when I returned home. The breathtaking mountains seemed to pass in a blur. Before I knew it, I was meeting Jacqueline at the pickup location. Oh no. Jacqueline's body just shifted. I thought she might be alive, but she's dead as that skeletal corpse in the chamber. But the thing inside her is not dead. And it just coiled. I heard friction against the carpet and turned to see her body, curling and twitching. Damn, I have to finish this, fast. So I told Jacqueline about the chamber and showed her the box during the 5-hour drive back to our place. She blamed me for not snapping photos and of that demented ceiling. I couldn't explain what the carving had done to my mind, how it had demanded my eyes and twisted my senses. We talked and caught up on everything. She'd visited me at various points along the trail, including a few weeks ago. So the biggest piece of new controversial material sat unopened in the trunk. What should we do if there's something really valuable in the box? Should we call someone and tell them about the body in the chamber, or just keep it to ourselves? She asked me. Let's just see what's in it first, then we'll talk about whether to call anyone. The body was like a century old, so I think you can wait a little longer for the authorities, I joked. I was in high spirits, enough to be laughing about the unsettling things I'd seen. A night in my own bed, with the love of my life laying in front of me. Jacqueline's next words made me feel like a shadow of the unknown had followed me out of the mountains. Are you sure we should open it at all? When we arrived home, I decided the chamber, the body, and their mysterious metal box had taken up too much of my time. I would open the damn thing then and there. Jacqueline, having driven a car for many hours in a row, went upstairs to shower. I went into the garage with a box and a sense of purpose. Out came a hammer and a screwdriver. It only took 10 minutes to wrench the lid off the box. As you've read, you've probably become just as curious as I was. Maybe even more so, given that you know how this story ends. Want to know what was inside that box? A piece of paper. There was a slip of century-old yellow paper with a few lines of ink. It fell out with a light sprinkle of grey dust. I could tell as soon as it fluttered to the workbench that it was nothing of value. Nothing that merited all the suspense. Guess what was written on it? A poem. A damn poem. Taking this thing from a surreal tomb, carrying it dozens of miles across the mountains, discussing it for 5 hours on the ride back home, for a poem and some dust. My disappointment fell away and dread bubbled to the surface when I read it. The hairs on my arms raised, and I felt as if something from a great distance had suddenly come much closer. I didn't understand it at the time, but looking at it now, I think I get it. From the cold and distant gloom, in muted gurgles of the mind, he calls, a perfect doom, for worms so weak and blind. We, with unknown means, create, his just and cruel commands. We fall, in holy hate. Our tubes become his hands. I remember feeling a tight knot in my stomach, the same way I'd felt looking at the carving, as if I saw a crack in the veil of reality, and there was something foul behind it. Then, exhaustion settled over my anxiety like drifting ashes. I walked upstairs in a trance and collapsed into bed. "What's wrong, babe?" said Jacqueline. "Was there anything in the box?" "Nothing," I told her to answer both questions. And then I was out. This time, in my dream, the grey powder filled skies across the world, and there was no place without muffled cries. Jacqueline just sat up, moved herself into a kneeling position, hands out front, head bowed, like she's praying. Her skin, what's left of it, is grey. She's dead. I know she's dead. I need to finish. I woke up to screaming, horrified screaming. Jacqueline was next to me in bed, shrieking and scrambling away from me, tears leaking from her eyes. There was something wrong with her skin. I rubbed my eyes and blinked. That's when I noticed it was on my hands as well. Holes. Small holes, about the size of the nail on my pinky finger, covered Jacqueline's entire body, her face. They were on my hands, my arms, my whole body. I screamed too. It took around 10 minutes to gather myself and go to the bathroom to get a better look, to figure out what was happening. Jacqueline whimpered in the fetal position. I wanted to comfort her, but couldn't find the words. First, I had to figure things out. I'd look in the bathroom. I'd recognize that this was some uncommon disease, and we'd go to the hospital and fix it. That was my plan. The holes were everywhere, but clustered in dense, honeycomb-like patches. Each was about half an inch deep, with red, irritated skin at the bottom. The edges of the holes, the parts that weren't soft and sunken, were rough and almost brittle. I gagged as I ran my fingers over my pockmarked skin. The feelings of disgust and fear I felt. I didn't know what disease this could be, but it was like nothing I'd ever heard of. Running my hands over my pockmarked body, feeling the squishy pits and their tough trims all over my damn skin. My face, a porous mass of flesh, no longer looked human in the mirror. I felt a great helplessness overwhelm me, a whisper in my mind telling me that nothing but prayer could possibly save me now. Prayer, like the praying body. And then I realized. The dust. The grey dust in that box. It was something foul. Some kind of spore or virus. And it had infected me. And it had infected Jacqueline too. That's when I understood that I was not escaping this. I would not live. Neither would Jacqueline. A sickness from some unknown had crawled into our bodies. I understood my dreams and the poem. I understood that we were the first, that we were meant to spread our affliction to all of humanity. I couldn't let that happen. Jacqueline moaned from the other room. "We have to go to the hospital," she repeated. "No," I said. "What?" I heard the confusion in her voice, and above it all, a thick, suffocating disgust. Jacqueline didn't like the holes. She didn't even like the bubble bath I once prepared because the bubbles reminded her of holes. She was in hell, Jackie, I said, something is really, really wrong, and we're not gonna get better. What are you saying? How do you know? Her questions rose in a note of panic. This came from the powder in the box, and it infected us. You weren't even exposed to the original spores, but you were exposed to me, which means it's contagious, airborne, and it sets in fast. We can't go outside. I was strangely calm now that I'd accepted it. The only problem was how to die without letting others get infected, and how to deal with Jacqueline. She became hysterical, had a panic attack, tried to leave. I wouldn't let her. I felt as if the world was depending on me. If the corruption inside our bodies left this house, it would ravage our species. I knew that from the dreams. Eventually, she grew violent. She tried to shove me away and rushed through the front door. I had to stop her. At first, I only wanted to knock her out, so we could spend a few more hours together. But when my hands, distorted with the holes, closed around her porous throat, I realized I didn't want her to suffer. I would do this myself. And so I squeezed and wept. And now I'm typing this out. My insides are churning with new organs, the holes in my skin growing deeper, my head spinning. The air is heavy with a musty, death-like odor. I am not long for this world. Jackie's body is sitting now, praying to the thing out there that made this sickness. A fleshy tube of fungal growth has sprouted from the back of her neck. Grey powder puffs out of it. I can sense the parasite compelling me to leave the house and to kneel, to bow my head and let the tube emerge. I will not let this evil thing use my own body to pollinate the world with death. I hope I don't survive. I love you, Jackie. And to everyone else, good luck.